evening, everybody. I'm your host, Margie Kay. This is another edition of UNX News Radio. My guest this evening is Richard Dolan. He's considered by many students of the UFO phenomenon to be the preeminent historian on the subject. He's the author of 2 volumes of history, UFOs and the National Security State, as well as an analysis of the future, AD, After Disclosure, The People's Guide to Life After Contact. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he studied at Alfred University and Oxford University. And Richard, I am wondering how a student of U.S. Cold War strategy, Soviet history and culture, and international diplomacy gets into the topic of UFOs.
Hi, Margie. First, thanks for having me on your show. It's a real pleasure. Well, you know, how I got into this is just one of those, one life journey out of many, many millions of other people's journeys, and this is mine. I was in my early 30s, a very serious-minded student who wanted to finish a PhD program in history and studying all about Harry Truman and his people and his national security policy. And as I've sometimes put it in the past, I just became obsessed with the UFO phenomenon. It was really, as far as I can tell, just an intellectual fascination. I came across Timothy Good's classic book, Above Top Secret, and I think that got me started. I believe I was 33 years old and couldn't put it down. And the reason I couldn't put it down was simply that he did a very fine job in including snippets about many of the people that I had studied in my academic life, except that he included them in a UFO-related context and showing that this was, in fact, something that was being taken quite seriously. And, of course, as anyone who's spent any time in the university world knows, UFOs, flying saucers, this is not something that is done in that world, at least not in a serious way. And I thought, I feel like I'm living in a schizophrenic kind of society. We've got official truth where this is just nonsense. But as I soon discovered, there was this thing I called unofficial truth, which was that there seemed to be a lot of prominent and intelligent and well-informed individuals within the national security apparatus who were taking it quite seriously. And I simply wanted to know why this discrepancy. That as simple as that. I wasn't out to solve the mystery. I wasn't out even to find out if I thought UFOs were even real or if aliens were real. I started out at the absolute ground zero, ultra-conservative position, which for me was simply to find out, is this part of our history that is American and world history? And, hey, if it's a legitimate part of our history, how come it's not been written about in the official history books? And that got me started.
Well, that is a good question. Why do you think it has not been written about in the official history books?
Right. Well, this was one of my very first questions as well. And it just shows my interest in this topic has never been strictly at the scientific question of let's understand this phenomenon, although that's part of it. It's always been political. And it's always been tied up in one way or another with this exact question of yours. Well, I think the short answer is that what we find is that the UFO phenomenon has had serious national security connections. And what you find, you know, in our in the last 50, 60 years, we had a relatively brief moment in which our Freedom of Information Act here in the U.S. was relatively useful for UFO research. That is during the Jimmy Carter years. Mm-hmm. To this day, more than half of the many thousands of documents that we have through Freedom of Information on UFOs have come from that 4-year period of time, if you can believe it, which is great for the Carter administration and really lousy for everyone else. And what we learned from those declassified documents is that there was a definite military component to the UFO phenomenon insofar as we discovered that there were a lot of engagements that the United States military and other militaries around the world have had with these things, tracking them on radar, trying to engage them, occasional attempts to intercept them, reports being filed, going right up the chain of command, right up with distribution to the White House and the director of the CIA and all of the top level places. And so with that going on, we have to assume when you look at these reports, you're dealing with objects of unknown origin with apparent incredible capabilities, being seen over sensitive installations, that is places where no one's supposed to be, like Los Alamos, like Oak Ridge Nuclear Facility, a lot of our atomic nuclear facilities, a lot of our Air Force and Army bases and naval installations would encounter these things. And no one would know what they were. So, you think about it. And forget crash retrievals, forget Roswell and things like that for a moment. Just look at the phenomenon itself. If you've got objects of extreme capability like this that you can control and you really don't have the ability to deal with, how on earth are you supposed to tell the world about this? And particularly in the immediate post-World War II context, the whole world was lying flat on its back after this titanic struggle of the Second World War. And all people wanted to do is get back to some kind of normal life. You had millions of homeless and other people on the verge of starvation. And now you've got this. How do you tell this to the world in the context of an early Cold War? These are questions that had to be the most difficult ones to answer for the top-level decision makers. And then factor in, which surely looks like is the case, that there were actual physical retrievals of these objects, of these crafts, of highly exotic technology. And we get these stories not through official documentation, but we do get them through an enormous number of leaks, I would say of very high quality for the most part, that describe this type of a process in detail. That is, we recovered technology. So if you have that, now it goes even further. You've got exotic technology. You certainly would not want to share that with the Soviet Union. You would not want necessarily the world to know about it right away. You need to study it. You need to find out what are the implications. And so it would require intense secrecy. It would require the development of a kind of a black budget so that you can't even let Congress know that you're studying this stuff and putting R&D money. So you've got this whole secrecy apparatus, and one of the key things therefore is you have to put the public to sleep, as it were, on this topic. You can't just let people dive in willy-nilly and investigate it. So you've got to put a kind of propaganda spin out there that this is all nonsense, it's all misidentification. And that's exactly what happened. So you get the ball rolling in the 40s and 50s. That includes the academic community. That includes the mainstream journalistic community, the political community. And for people who think that that's impossible to control, I think they need to get their heads out of the sand and get some education over the last couple of decades in what we have learned about how the journalistic community has been and can be manipulated and is to this day.
Oh, yes.
Same with, the whole thing, the academic, the same, political. So I think that's what's happened. You have what starts out as a very specifically oriented cover-up, but that then develops its own cultural momentum and its own power of its on itself. And now we're 60, 70 years really into this. And I marvel when I ask myself, how do you undo this level of deception, this level of lying? And well, that's another of those questions that can just engage us for hours, I think.
Oh, sure. Everybody's speculated about disclosure, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen. And it's all speculation because we really don't know what the tone of any president is in office, what's going to happen. A lot of people this time, though, before Obama was in office, really seemed to have some optimism about this administration being more forthcoming. And I'm not sure why they felt that way, but don't
get me started.
It never turns out.
or maybe do get me started. I don't know. Yeah. I remember when, of course, that whole transition occurred. And yes, there's always the optimism that the new guy is somehow different from the old guy. Mm-hmm. Actually, the real buildup to the Obama disclosure non-event, I remember, was toward the end of his first year. And there were people. There was Alfred Weber. There was David Wilcock, probably the two most prominent. There were others who said, yes, Obama's going to disclose toward the end of 2009. There were several alleged Obama disclosure dates. That's the one I remember best. And I said to people at the time, anyone who'd be willing to listen to me, I said, do not hold your breath. This is based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. I never saw it as anything more than wish fulfillment, wishful thinking. And of course it hasn't happened. And it's not to say that it can never happen, that a president will never do it. I think that's an erroneous piece of logic, but there's certainly no motivation for these guys to disclose. I've often said it's a great paradox, disclosure, which is that it's impossible, but it's inevitable. And I probably said it so many times that people are like, yeah, there he goes again. But it is impossible in the sense that there's just no motivation, as I see, for those people who have this secret to give it up. There's just too much for them to lose. But the good news for the rest of us, good news if you believe in disclosure, is that they're only one part of the equation. There's other things going on in this world, and they don't control every single thing. We are ourselves as a society going through tremendous change. And we're seeing this battle for truth take place on multiple fronts right now, in terms of leaked documents, whistleblowers, and the like. We've been hearing about Edward Snowden. We've been hearing about, for him, Julian Assange, and many of the other people who are going out there telling the truth about this and that. So there's a battle, and that's not going to go away. That's only going to intensify, and where it ends up is really one of the great questions of our age.
It does seem to be a snowball effect going on right now with truth coming out from all different angles. And so I'm hopeful too that something will come along these lines. Perhaps some big name, general or somebody will come forward and get public. Like you mentioned earlier, we've got the media blackout. I mean, I've experienced that here in Kansas City and doing UFO investigations. And when we had this huge flap in 2011-12 here, I was interviewed by a number of people, and then one of them I was interviewed 3 times and on site where he was a witness as well, and he was able to get this on one of the major channels 3 times, and it went to CNN even, and then nothing. He says, my higher ups said we got to cut it off. I said, enough said.
Oh, exactly. Well, I think there are so many very credible direct accounts of news organizations being explicitly directed to handle the UFO topic in a certain way, always to belittle it, always to minimize it. I got very directly from the brother of a top news editor at National Public Radio, NPR, who was told by his sibling, who's high level up in there, that this was an explicit directive at NPR to minimize, belittle all UFO stories, never to treat them in a serious way. And I have to think that this is the norm, not the exception. At least for the most part. Occasionally, a few major news outlets will not dismiss it entirely. But I think overall, when the matter gets very, very serious, it becomes dismissive. And by very serious, I mean simply this. It's one thing for news outlets to cover sightings, and they will from time to time do that. And they will sometimes do it in a non-dismissive way. But here is where they will always draw the line. I have never seen an exception to this, which is, fine, it's here, there's something happening, and sometimes you'll get that, but then what are the implications? That is in terms of government secrecy. I have never heard any kind of even remotely mainstream TV or radio entity, other than, what we are, alternative radio, but maybe coast to coast is about as far as you go, right? Mm-hmm. Where there will actually be a genuine discussion about the political implications of UFO secrecy. This is so important. This is the secret that I think that will turn that whole apple cart over and start the mayhem once this is opened up. And it's not hard to see why there's a motivation to keep things on the down low. But again, the bottom line is that they can't keep it secret forever. I just personally believe that they can't do it. And I guess we'll have to see how that plays out.
Exactly. And we can hope. But like you said, it really doesn't matter too much because it's coming out in the public anyway. I mean, if you ask anybody on the street about the UFO phenomena, if they haven't ever seen one, they'll say, I haven't seen one, but I'm open to the idea. I mean, or they believe they're there. I mean, we've got investigators that have never seen a UFO, but they know they exist because they've talked to so many people who've seen them.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And what I've found in my private life, outside of anything to do with the UFO phenomenon, is when I meet people and then they find out that I'm a UFO researcher, almost always discover that these people have a real hunger for truth about this. And it's often something that they didn't even realize that they had. I mean, most people don't know a lot about the UFO phenomenon, but they know enough that it's intriguing to them, and they sense that they're not getting the full scoop from the official channels of information and power in our society. So when they meet somebody who actually has a take on this that's interesting, they want to listen and they want to learn. So there's, I think, a very broad-based hunger for truth about this that people like ourselves, have to keep working at tapping that hunger. But the other thing is, of course, is that, as I was saying before, our whole civilization has gone through such a tremendous revolution in communication and knowledge, and it's not done yet. It's not done yet. We're going to be continuing this conversation, continuing to learn more from each other, and the real question will be what will cause the breaking point. We're looking at two different possibilities as I see it over the next generation. One is that this openness of communication that we've been experiencing will continue and will become the dominant force in our civilization in the next 20 years. Or conversely, the other side of the fence, those groups and forces that want to control and dominate and restrict communication and knowledge will gain the upper hand through intimidation, through surveillance, and so forth. And we're seeing this battle full-blown right now. But the thing is, the battle's not done. So that's really, that is the great issue for our time, is this battle over truth and the battle over the ability of people fearlessly to learn from each other without having to worry about government reprisals. That's the problem, and that's the issue. And it's an exciting time to live in. It's also very important that this battle ends up on the correct side, not the wrong side.
Exactly. I put a notice out yesterday on Facebook about the show, as I always do, and I had several responses. And one person said, if Richard Dolan wants to see UFOs, tell him to come to my backyard because they're here almost every night. So that begs a question. Have you ever seen a UFO?
I think on 2 occasions I have seen what I would consider to be a UFO. They're both actually rather interesting. Neither were earth-shaking, but both were certainly interesting, and I've thought about them ever since, and I'll just mention them briefly here. One I've talked about a few times, the other not so much. So the first one was in 1999 in the spring, right here in Rochester, New York, where I live. And I was outside in front of my house with my son, who was 3 years old at the time. He was a little guy, and we were on the sidewalk, and it was a perfect blue sky, nice afternoon. It was, in Rochester, you have to understand, we get a lot of rain and clouds. But on this day, nothing in the sky. It was gorgeous. And this very bright object caught my attention. Now, I happen to live near an airport, the Rochester International Airport, and I see aircraft all the time. So I thought, well, this is the brightest reflective aircraft I've ever seen. That was my initial reaction, because it was intensely bright, extremely bright, and it just arrested my attention. So I stood there and I looked up and I thought, what the heck is that thing? It looked like it was moving very slowly. Of course, that motion can sometimes be deceptive when you're looking at an object. So I thought I was just going to look at it until I could make out a shape, because all I could see was a very bright light. So I'm standing there, and my poor son, who, he's a genius, but he was only 3 years old at the time, so he's looking at his dad standing like a statue, wondering, what's wrong with Daddy? Meanwhile, I'm looking at this, and I became absolutely just enchanted, or mesmerized, maybe might be the right word, by this thing. And I thought, you must not look away. If you look away, you'll never see it again. Which, as I've sometimes said before, makes no sense. It made no sense. Even if it had lost its reflection, where was it going to go? It would have been easy for me to see. But I had this idea, don't look away. And so I was staring at it, waiting to see it better. But my poor son was having a fit next to me trying to get my attention. So I thought, okay, I have to be a dad here for a second. So I knew I would have to face him. So I actually put my left arm out and I pointed at the object to hold its place in the sky. And literally for 1 second only, I turned to my son. And when I turned back, that thing was gone.
Oh.
Just gone. And I thought, come on, guys, really? What are you doing here to me? I spent the next 5 minutes looking everywhere for that thing, and it was just not to be found. So I really wondered if it was somehow like inside my head. Was that a little tap on my shoulder? Hello, Richard, you're about to finish your first book. Just thought we'd say hi. On another occasion, a number of years later, I was walking. We had an evening walk. It was my wife and my daughter, Elaine, and our family dog. Our son was out with friends. And Elaine was 8 years old at the time, so this would be 2000, almost 2000, the summer of 06. And it was a beautiful night. It was late July. It was about a week or two before the meteor shower that you get every year. So let's keep that in mind. But here's the thing. So we're walking, and I jokingly said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we all looked up right now and saw a UFO? Because I am the UFO guy in the house. Mm-hmm. So I was laughing, and my daughter and I looked up, and we both saw this thing zooming across the sky. This is, no aircraft could ever do this. So you think, well, maybe it was a meteorite, which, okay, maybe that was the case. But here's the thing about it. It zoomed across the sky and went into this very thin layer of cloud, very thin, and it never came out. I mean, it wasn't a big thing of cloud, and I'm waiting for it to come out, and it never did. So maybe it burned out just at that moment, just behind a thin cloud. But whatever. My daughter was young enough that she got scared by what she saw. I think it freaked her out a little bit, and I remember I had to calm her down and say, no, it was just a meteorite, don't worry. But really, we've both wondered about that ever since. So, again, it was one of these things where I wondered, could it be responding to my own thought? You go through the literature, you go through witness accounts of, forget abduction, just of UFO sightings, and you frequently come across this idea that people believe the thing was responding to their mind. And I certainly cannot rule it out in my own case. So those are the two that I've had. But I had one really great evening with some excellent quality. I've done it a few times, but on one occasion I had really good access to the glasses. This was about 5 years ago, actually, in, southwestern Illinois. I was doing a conference with my very good friend Sam Moranto out of Illinois MUFON. And we were near the town of Galena, if anyone knows where that is. So there was a sky watch, night watch being done. One person there had a couple of very good and expensive night vision glasses, binoculars. So I think about 10 of us, maybe 10 or 15 of us were out that night from 11 p.m. till about 1 a.m. So a good 2 solid hours I was out with a great group of people. And the visibility was good. It was a nice, clear night. And I'm thinking this is like August, late July, maybe early August. And my God, what shocked me, absolutely shocked me, was when you put the night vision on, the night sky looks like the New York State Thruway. It's just, traffic is unreal. I thought, you got to be kidding me. There are so many objects up there. And it's one thing to say, okay, these are satellites. A lot of them were your standard kind of slow-moving satellites, but a lot of them were very strange. A lot of very high-speed objects, very high-altitude, high-speed objects. A number of them pulsing. A number of them, all different directions. And I was shocked by the quantity. I would say in 2 hours, there were probably, more than 100 objects that you could only see with the night vision that would not have been visible with the naked eye. There was just, this is one little corner of the earth, southwestern Illinois. An awful lot going on there. I didn't see anything that like stopped and then took off. I mean, that did something that I really would have not been able to explain. But there were enough of these objects that made me think that there is the existence of what's called a trans-atmospheric vehicle, or TAV. This is one of these things that aerospace people have talked about for years. It's never been officially confirmed, but in other words, a craft that can go into the upper atmosphere or beyond and, get you from New York to Tokyo in just a couple of hours, in other words, by going that high. And after that night, I really believe that that's a genuine possibility. There's a lot out there. There were some satellites that were just, I don't even know if they were satellites. There's one I'll never forget. It was this pulsing object that was going at a very good clip, and it just was pulsing, and it almost looked like it went off into space from my vantage point. It's hard for me to tell. But yeah, I mean, the bottom line is if you get decent night vision glasses and you spend some time outside, you're going to see a lot. There's certainly a lot going on.
Oh, there certainly is. First time I used those, there were like $12,000 goggles or binoculars.
Well, those are better than even the ones that I had. I had good ones, but I don't think they were $12,000.
I mean, it was just amazing because the number of stars that you can see, first of all, is just shocking. Mm-hmm. And then to see these objects, what we did was we timed and made a note of each object as it went by, what direction it was going, and the time. And then the next day, I got on this satellite app, and you could see what days and times that you should be able to see them from a certain location. There were only supposed to be 3, and we had seen at least 25 or 30 objects. And some of them behaved in very strange ways.
Certainly there are many, many classified satellites that are out there. I mean, that's one of the limitations of these apps is simply that they cannot in any way be comprehensive. So just because it doesn't appear on a satellite app doesn't mean it's an actual alien craft. But it's something that's not accounted for. And in fact, now that I'm thinking of it, I don't think really it sunk in on me till just this moment. But that night, that was in the summer of '08, I think that was just another link in the chain of, and when I was formulating this idea that I wrote about the following year of a breakaway civilization, because it really occurred to me that there is a substantial infrastructure that has got a tremendous, there's a lot of activity in Earth's upper atmosphere. Someone is behind it. None of it is official, but there it is. And I think that was one of the things that helped me to formulate, or at least kind of visualize, this idea of a black budget world that has gone so far ahead of the rest of us poor slobs that they're doing this thing out there, and they probably have little to no way of even knowing how to bring us up to speed. Maybe that's the problem. I've
got a question in the chat room. In which way would you like to see disclosures start to go viral? How would you prefer it to start?
That's an interesting question. I think how I would prefer, would be through an embarrassing leak. I think that, to me, would be the best way. So we have groups like Anonymous, we have WikiLeaks, we have all of these growing number of whistleblowers. And, let me just qualify that phrase whistleblower, because it's one of these terms that I think has been very, very overused in the last decade. Not everyone who claims to be a whistleblower is an actual whistleblower. I mean, to be a whistleblower, you have to have your identity be confirmed. Your background has got to be confirmed. And you can't just be someone with a good story. That doesn't count for me. But there are a number of genuine, bona fide whistleblowers out there who are, of course, talking about whether it's NSA spying on everyone, or war crimes, or what have you. And I do think my personal preferred method of disclosure would be a leak, and that's going to be so difficult to deny that it would get its own momentum. What I suppose the best scenario but this is so idealistic, I can't even conceive that it will ever happen, would be if the United States president were actually to grow a conscience and some courage and decide, it's time. We've got to reclaim our history from the generations and lifetime of lies. I think that would be the best way to do it, but I don't think that that's even remotely realistic. I think disclosure will only happen when it is forced upon the political leadership. When people write to me, by the way, about disclosure, and it's obvious to me they haven't read a single thing that I've written, because they make certain assumptions about what I think. They think that I believe that disclosure is going to be this wonderful, wild, utopian ride, which I don't. Or they think that I believe that the government's voluntarily going to disclose the truth, which I have never, ever argued. I've never suggested that. But I do think, nonetheless, that it will happen. It will be a forced event. And that doesn't mean that the government will even disclose things truthfully. That's the other thing we have to remember. They haven't been truthful about a whole lot to begin with, and there's no reason to think that the CIA is simply going to fold up their table and say, okay, here's the whole truth. You got us. Here. Obviously, they've been invested in this phenomenon and in a particular spin on it for a long time, and they're obviously going to continue to try to control the spin on this once there is a disclosure. So, as I often try to remind people, disclosure is not the end of much. It's the beginning of a new phase of the battle for truth. And people like ourselves, people who care about this, who care about truth, are going to have to step up our game, not step back at that moment. We're going to have to be very active and make sure that the public discussion of this phenomenon goes in a responsible direction that is responsive to the people, to the public, not simply to a handful of elite that want to continue to manage this problem.
What do you think of the notion that the government or our military has super advanced technology, and who knows where they got it from, but whatever, and that many of these objects are being seen and then reported as a UFO, and they just go ahead and have that cover story that our technology is a UFO?
Well, this is a major meme that has circulated for decades. I'm not saying it isn't true, but it is something that we have to be a little bit, to some extent, we have to be skeptical and suspicious of that idea. This is something, for example, that the chief historian of the CIA in 1997, a fellow at the time, his name is Gerald Haynes, wrote an article as a CIA historian. It got a lot of play in the media. And that's basically what he said, which was, yeah, you got us. All of those UFO sightings that people were seeing in the 1950s and 60s, many of them, he said, were actually of the CIA's A-12 Oxcart program, which became the SR-71 Blackbird. And at one point in that article, he actually said more than 50% of all of those sightings were of that aircraft, and that's complete nonsense. Those craft, or the U-2 aircraft, he also brought into the argument. They fly at 80,000 feet and higher, and they go straight as a string. They don't hover. They don't maneuver. But yet people buy this argument without really even, I think, a lot of critical thinking. Now, there is the argument that, for example, regarding the triangular aircraft, triangular UFO phenomenon, which have been seen, surprisingly, people may find that this has been seen for many, many decades, going back to the 1940s and 30s and even before. And there are many people who argue that this, in fact, is a U.S. black budget craft called the TR-3B, the Black Manta. Well, I'm not saying that there isn't a TR-3B, but the fact is we really don't even know to this day that there is. There's been one man, really one primary guy, who's been arguing for its existence, Edgar Fouché, who I know and I like, but he's one guy. There's not a lot more from other sources about this. And even if there is a TR-3A and a TR-3B, does not explain a lot of these early sightings of triangles. And it's the same with any of the other aspects of the UFO phenomenon. You know, there was a report I remember studying out of Guam in 1947, summer of 47, U.S. military personnel who reported an object zigzagging, actually two objects, and they were coming in a zigzag toward their base, going into a cloud, coming back out the opposite direction, in other words, reversing course, and then taking off. I mean, what does that? Is this an experimental aircraft also? If we're going to put that argument out there, then we need to at least have a reasonable hypothesis. I was just reading an article recently, someone put on my Facebook wall today, as a matter of fact, regarding the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting of June of 1947, and arguing that what he saw was one of the successors to the famous Horton wing design of the Second World War, the HU-229. Now, I mean, look, I don't want to say that's impossible, but Arnold claimed to have seen about, I think, 9 of these. He did his own speed calculation, and his conservative estimate was that they were going at about 1,200 miles per hour. Now, I suppose you can discount that, and then you'd have to discount the fact that he said he saw 9, because how are there going to be 9 of these prototypes flying around? I mean, let's get real. And then where have they been since 1947? So has this technology literally been secret ever since? You know, something that can go that fast, and, you know, with those type of capabilities, it would have been handy in the Korean War, I suppose. It wasn't there, or Vietnam. So it's not that these are impossible, but the question that I ask is how long are you going to keep the technology? If it's U.S. military, how long are you going to keep it classified? Now, there is the idea, and I'm one of the main people who put this out. In fact, I created the term breakaway civilization, and I do think that there is a portion of the black budget community that has probably, nearly certainly, gotten kind of advanced runaway technology. So if you've recovered technology at Roswell, recovered it at Aztec, New Mexico, and other places, so you've got this. Well, obviously, you're not just going to sit on your hands looking at it for 60 years. You're going to try to study it and make developments out of it. Some of these developments would turn out to be nice money makers, and everyone's happy with the profit going back into the defense industry. But some of these developments might be a little bit too good to share with even the formal military, like anti-gravity or some kind of radical propulsion, because if you've got that really could transform the world in unpredictable ways. So that might not get segued out into the rest of the world, but you would still want to study it. You'd still want to develop it, and you might secretly, quietly develop, hey, your own fleet of flying saucers. Why not? Certainly there have been many allegations that this, in fact, has been the case. It doesn't strike me as illogical. If you do that, then it has to remain very much on the down low. It's got to be quiet. And now you've got basically a portion of human civilization with, well, breakaway radical technology. That's a possibility.
Wow.
But the problem that we have is confirming it. I myself, I put the idea out there, but I cannot confirm it. To me, it's just a logical hypothesis, and unfortunately, nothing more. I don't have sufficient proof that it's the case. So,
well, now you've given me a lot more to think about. I didn't need anything else to think about.
Yeah, well, this has been one of my themes for the past couple of years. Has been I work a number of different themes, and that's one of them. I do think it's worth consideration. I actually have an article on my new spanking new flashy website, richarddolanpress.com. I have a lot of articles I've written over the years, and that's one of them. I have an article called "The Breakaway Civilization," and I would encourage people, if you're interested in that, to go read it, check it out. It's a nice formulation of my concept. I've written about it in a couple of books, but I wanted to have an article on the web for people to read too. Okay.
In your research, Mr. Dolan, have you ever come across any connections between UFOs and Bigfoot?
Yes and no. I I have to say I have never really spent enough time focusing solely on the Bigfoot or cryptid phenomenon. I do find it fascinating. And I will say that I've had some long conversations with dedicated Bigfoot researchers. I know a lot of these people at this point. They know me. We share information. I think among the cryptid research community, you get really a division, a major schism on exactly this issue. There are Bigfoot researchers who adamantly say that this is a biological creature, he's here, or they're here, and they're just elusive. Like the coelacanth was, for thousands, hundreds of millions of years. Maybe. You have a whole other strand of thought that connects it not simply with the UFO phenomenon, but as some kind of interdimensional entity. I don't really know where I stand on this issue, but I will say that my friend and colleague Stan Gordon, who has been based out of Western Pennsylvania since forever, he's done a tremendous amount of work on both of these phenomena for years, over 40 years each. He's into Bigfoot and he's into UFOs. Stan is of the opinion strongly that there is a connection. In fact, he has recently written a book that deals with 1 year only, 1973. Believe it or not, he's got a whole book on that 1 year. And in Western Pennsylvania, 1973 in Western PA, and he tracks Bigfoot and UFO cases, and it is his opinion that there is a connection, that there's somehow a relationship. Is that what it is? I wish I could have my own definitive opinion. I don't really have a definitive opinion on this yet. Maybe one day I'll develop something.
Okay, fair enough. All right, well, I've got more questions in chat, so let me run through these. Knowing that the ramifications and implications of the subject are more profound than the actual aerial phenomena itself, how do you cope with the fact that the success of your life's work on disclosure will be the very thing that will cause the system structures upholding the status quo to collapse?
Well, it's a good question in a way, but the thing is, it's not like I'm hoping for one thing or another. I'm not a cheerleader. I guess I have a faith. I have one matter of faith that I do have, which is that it's better to have a society based on a foundation of truth than on a foundation of falsehood, of lies. That is a philosophical position that I have, and maybe it's the wrong one. Maybe we're at a point where we can't handle the truth. Maybe that's it. But it's not my opinion. Now, but really what I have a long view historical perspective on this. In other words, I think that all of us in this historical drama, we all have a part to play. And sometimes we get this idea that we are going to be a real factor in making the change, when in fact, as I see it, we're just a drop in the stream. We think that we have all of this ability and maybe not as much as we want. If you ever read Tolstoy's War and Peace, he does a brilliant analysis of exactly this issue. And in War and Peace, he depicts Napoleon Bonaparte himself and shows that even though Napoleon thought he was this great actor upon the world stage, that even Napoleon was being carried along by events and really not the initiator of action the way he thought. And so when I look at myself in relationship to this issue of disclosure, what I am, I'm a chronicler, and I guess I'm a truth teller. I'm not an activist, self-described. What I'm saying to people is, this is the situation, and if I'm not going to step up to speak about it, then someone else is going to do it. That's just how it is. If Julian Assange of WikiLeaks were not existing, someone else would fulfill that role. That's the way it's going to be. And it's the same with me. It's the same with anyone else in this field. This disclosure, I keep saying it is an inevitability. To think otherwise, I think, is deceiving ourselves. We're moving on a path, on a track. And it's going to happen. We're never going to be ready for disclosure. One analogy that I've sometimes said is like, what parent is ever ready for their first child? No one. No one's ever ready for their first child. But you have it, and there it is, and boom. You have to deal with it. And disclosure is going to be a messy, unpredictable ride. But, consider this to the person who asked this question. I think it's going to result in a lot of unhappy people, a lot of mass demonstrations. You think of Occupy Wall Street. Well, how about Occupy Area 51? How about Occupy Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? How about Occupy the Pentagon? Don't think that'll happen? Think again. There's going to be a lot of people in the streets. There could be violence in the streets. I mean, this is all a real possibility. But if you're going to clean up a rotten, corrupt system built on a web of lies, there's no other way to do it, and I'll just leave it at that.
Richard, I would like to get to talk a little bit about your new book.
Yeah, sure. I'd be very happy to. I've been busy on a number of fronts this entire year. I mean, every year that I live, it seems like I say, this is the busiest year I've ever had in my life. And, but I think this is the busiest year I've ever had in my life. I think 2013 might be it. I am very, very close to completion of a book that I have been working on now for, it's up to 2 years. It is called UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. Think of it as a new introduction to the entire field. It's really my attempt at this stage in the game to give, something of my everything talk on what I think the entire field of UFOs is about. I think it's a fresh introduction, be about 300 pages or so. So like a manageable, digestible, but forward-thinking, I like to think, kind of overview of the entire phenomenon. So that's what I've had there, and it covers. I mean, I'm a historian. That's really my background. So it does cover a lot of the history of what I think are the important sightings. But it covers the politics, and not just the surface level politics, but the deep politics. It covers a philosophy, like a philosophical understanding of what the UFO phenomenon really is. How can we be critically minded in understanding UFO sightings in today's age of drones and of all kinds of other high-tech things that can be tricky to our analysis. An age of YouTube, an age of copy and paste journalism known as Facebook,
Yeah.
How do we sort all of this out? And I have what I think are actually useful and practical things to say about those. I talk about the science of UFOs. That is, the weird sciences that are associated with this phenomenon. Everything from the science of propulsion technology to space-time to dimensions to consciousness itself. All of these things are important factors, I think, in a contemporary understanding of the UFO phenomenon. The whole issue of abduction and contact of all of its manifestations, from people who talk about or seem to have been actually physically taken to people who've had what they consider to be mental communications with other beings. And how do we make sense of these things? So all of these are part of my formulation of the topic, including a talk about the future. I mean, I wrote a book about disclosure, about the future, and I have that as a chapter, basically into the future. What do I see this whole field doing in the next generation or so? So that's it. And I think experienced students of the phenomenon might say, oh, well, that's interesting. But I think even they will get a new perspective out of it. And I think that people who are sort of coming to this field for the first time, I want this book to be something that engages them. I have a chapter on ancient aliens, the ancient UFO phenomenon as well, I should have mentioned, and my whole take on a lot of that. So if anyone's ever seen a couple of episodes of Ancient Aliens, I try to deal with that. I'm still working on that. I keep tweaking all of these chapters, but I want to make them as perfect as I can before it comes out. So that book, I think, will be out in about a month. That's UFOs for the 21st Century Mind. I do have a publishing company. I've recently renamed it. It was, for many years, Keyhole Publishing. It's now called Richard Dolan Press. And I've been very, very active with Richard Dolan Press this year. Earlier this year, I published a fantastic book by the Canadian researcher Grant Cameron, co-authored with Scott Crane, who lives in Pennsylvania. That's a very fine book called UFOs, Area 51, and Government Informants. That's on the website, richarddolanpress.com. You can check it out. I just recently, in the last month, published 2 books. I'm really excited about both of these. I think they're both fabulous books. One is by up till now little-known researcher named David Marler. A lot of serious researchers knew David. I knew him. But I think a lot of folks did not know much about him. And he wrote the first ever book-length treatment of triangular UFOs. And the book is called Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. It's a great book, beautifully illustrated. And David is one of these people who's had one of the best personal libraries, and in particular, libraries of newspaper clippings that you'll find anywhere in the country. And he used it extensively in putting this book together on triangular UFO phenomenon. And it's just wonderful. Absolutely the authoritative treatment of the subject so far.
Wow. That sounds good.
It's a great book, and I was so glad to be publishing it, and I ran it through my own editing and helped put that together, and it's great. And I just published less than about a week ago, a book by the very experienced researcher in this field, Bob Wood, Dr. Robert Wood, who is, I don't know his age, but he's over 80. But Bob Wood is a retired aerospace executive, formerly at McDonnell Douglas Aviation Company, and he's a PhD. He, along with his son Ryan Wood, runs the website majesticdocuments.com. And of course, these are, this is the home of all of these leaked and disputed, but maybe, just maybe true documents dealing with some of the deeper aspects of the UFO ET phenomenon. I think Bob and Ryan have made an extremely capable and spirited defense of the authenticity of those documents. And I encourage people to go check out the website. But what Bob has written is a book called Alien Viruses, and the subtitle is UFOs, MJ-12, and Biowarfare.
Oh.
Now, I'm going to tell you, this book, by the way, is ghost written by Nick Redfern, who is one of the best writers in this field. Nick's a great researcher and a very excellent writer. And so Nick really put it together. It's all Bob's research and all of his ideas. And this is a fascinating book. I don't want to. I'd rather have Bob talk about it at length, and I'll be interviewing Bob myself for my radio show on KGRA, which will be on tomorrow night. But long story short, he's done a very sophisticated, detailed analysis of a lot of these Majestic documents, as well as analysis of the open source literature. And he has a whole chapter, for example, on the mysterious deaths of all those microbiologists and virologists about 10 years ago. I'm sure many people remember this. Mm-hmm. A lot of these guys turned up dead from, quote, suicide. Well, they weren't suicides, or strange car accidents and what. They were being killed off. And he has a whole chapter on it. What he really argues is that the study of alien biology has actually had a major impact on our world in a covert way. And that if anyone really wanted to kill off humanity, that they would probably best do it through viruses. And it's a kind of a chilling book, but it's a page turner. So that's one that has just come out. I'm about to publish. I haven't even almost announced this. This just came on me so quickly, but I'll be publishing in the next week a novel by experienced UFO researcher from the UK, Philip Mantle. And Philip Mantle's written many, many books on this topic. Well, in his own research into abductions over the years, he has put together a novelized form of a real abduction encounter that he himself personally researched and investigated. And that's going to be coming out. I think I'll be able to have that out actually as early as Monday, believe it or not. So I've been keeping myself very, very busy. And then on the horizon, let me not forget the book that I will be publishing this summer by my very good friend and fellow KGRA pro, Chase Kletzky. Chase Kletzky has written a book, which I'm actually doing the edits on right now. It's a book called Admissible. And this is, think of it as it's a modern field investigator's manual for UFOs, paranormal activity, and strange creatures. So it's kind of a very, I think it's going to be the go-to book for new investigators in any of those fields, UFOs, cryptids, or ghost hunting, basically. And the thing about Chase is, I think many fans of hers know, she's someone who has done all of those types of investigations, and she's not a regular kind of person. She is a go-getter who doesn't mind getting her feet wet, her hands dirty, and she knows how to go through the process of proper protocols to do a genuinely good investigation, not a half-assed investigation where you don't take good notes and where you don't put together a final report. The title admissible, the whole concept of that is that she wants people to understand how to put together a report so well that it would be admissible even in a court of law. That's the thing. So it really, I think it's a very good manual to bring up the level of professionalism. And
it is. I can't wait to read it.
It'll be out this summer, and I can tell you, I'm going through that book very carefully. She really has thought this through, and my contribution. I'm having a more and more active contribution in this book than I had initially envisioned. But I want this book to sparkle. That's what I said to Chase, and she's very excited about that. So I've got my hands in this book, and I'm excited about it. I think it's got great potential. So this is really where I'm going these days. I'm doing my own work, my own writing, which will never ever stop. That'll keep me going till the day I die. But I'm also very much engaged in publishing works by other good authors, people who really have something to contribute, something to say. And I'm very flattered, honestly, by the fact that many of them are coming to me of their own initiative. They want to work with me. And I think what's happened is that this publishing company of mine, Richard Dolan Press, is getting some little bit of gravity to it. It's kind of getting some momentum, and I'm very happy that there are people who want to be part of this team, I guess.
Well, with your books and these great books from other people, I can't see anything other than success for you as far as that's concerned.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I've been working a long, long time in this field for, really just hacking away. I don't want to say hacking, but just off into the jungle of research. And I'm seeing now a point where things are really opening up. And I love the fact that I can work with so many really exceptional people and helping them get their work out. That's a very satisfying thing I found.
Well, this seems like the next, the logical next step.
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so.
There's a book here that really caught my eye, The Dark Side of Cupid by Eve Lorgan.
Yes, indeed. I published that book by Eve about a little over a year ago. It's a very interesting book, very, very interesting. And what Eve is the author of a previous book, called The Love Bite, and is subtitled, I think, Alien Interference in Human Love Affairs. So think about that for a minute. Well, this is a follow-up. The Dark Side of Cupid is a continuation of that research. And so the question is, and I think many people have wondered, have had love affairs, let's say strange love affairs, and maybe many of us have had a strange love affair at one point or another in our life, as to whether or not there is what we would call paranormal influence in it. And that's really the question that she explores. And I have to tell you, it's a really interesting book. What Eve does, she's a therapist, she's a counselor, and she has worked with a lot of people one-on-one to talk about their relationships. And I think what struck her, just this bizarre fact that there were a lot of these people, and it seemed to them and to her that there might just be paranormal influence in their some of these relationships, many of which had a kind of almost psychic vampiric type of quality to them, where you have like one person who was almost like a victim psychically of this other. And so there's a lot of interesting relationships that she depicts in that book. It's a fascinating story of one messed up relationship after another, but you can't just look at it as messed up people, because what you see is that there are truly bizarre elements to some of this. And yeah, that's her story. And I think it's a fine book. I'm very, very happy that I published it. That was about a year ago. It's been out for now about 12 months, 13 months, I think.
Well, that sounds very interesting, and I'm going to be sure to grab a copy myself and maybe get her on the program as well.
Oh, I think she'd give you a good interview. She's a genuinely decent and good and smart person, and she's thought a lot about this phenomenon for sure.
Now, I'd like to go back to the alien viruses for just a minute, because I do some remote viewing work, and just a couple of days ago, I was doing some work for somebody. It's a missing persons case, and didn't have anything to do with this case, but all of a sudden, this message came in to me about Morgellons disease, and that is actually an alien virus. And I'm wondering if if you have any knowledge of that.
Well, I got to check the index of the book to see if Morgellons is in it. I created that index, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head if he has it in. Not sure. And it would take me too long to go through this now to
That's
find it.
Not a problem. It's just something that popped into my head.
Right.
While you were going through this.
Keep it in mind, though, because, the book is now out, and I'm sure there'll be opportunities to look into this. I wish I could answer that definitively for you. I don't think so. I don't think he has Morgellons in there. He talks a lot about AIDS, the HIV virus. He talks quite a bit about a number of other viruses. In fact, designer viruses out of laboratories designed against certain types of people. Isn't that a nice thought? And I think that's how he certainly ties it into the Majestic documents, and he ties it in, as I was saying earlier, to the deaths of these microbiologists. These would be the top people in the world who would be able to develop vaccines against some of these nasty viruses. I remember when that was happening about a decade ago. It was a very creepy phenomenon. It went for a number of years, and all we were able to do is speculate. Well, if they're killing off the top microbiologists and virologists in the world, are they, whoever they are, planning some kind of nasty disease for the rest of us? And this is really something that Bob asks quite seriously in a very sophisticated way.
That's a very scary thought, but certainly conceivable.
Yeah.
Now, if people want to get a hold of your books, your website is richarddolanpress.com.
Mm-hmm.
For that, do you have any other websites?
Not really. I have the old Keyhole Publishing, but I think I've had that as on a redirect, or at least it's supposed to be on a redirect. So let's find out. I'm actually typing it in.
No, I typed it in and it's not. So it's still up.
Well, I'll have to talk to I see it's calling already. Well, I want that so that it's redirecting, because I'm really not doing anything with that site anymore.
Okay.
And I'm just going to have people go. So richarddolanpress.com is where you want to go. That's got all the up-to-date stuff that I've amassed over the years. And that site I'm going to continue to work. I finally got some training in WordPress from the two people who designed this site. I want to be able to update it and manage it myself over the years.
That's doable with WordPress. I really love it. And they did a great job. It looks fantastic.
I'm so happy. Yeah, I'm so happy with it. I used to run my own site for years. And, back in the previous decade, you could kind of get away with that. I used Dreamweaver, and it was an okay site. At times, it was a pretty good site for its time, but the needs are so much more sophisticated now, and there's only so many things that I can keep on top of, Yeah.
There comes a point when you realize you can't do everything.
No,
you don't have time for it.
Not a chance. So, when you really want something done right, you got to go to the people who know what they're doing.
Well, they sure did. Richard, I want to thank you so much for being on the show with me today. This has just been fantastic talking to you.
Oh, it's been a delight. I've never been on your show before, Margie, and I love it, and I'd be very happy to come back anytime.
Well, I would love you to come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a good night.
You too. And thank you to our listeners. This is Onyx News Radio. I'm your host, Margie Kay. Visit my website at margiekay.com. That's margiekay.com. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Onyx News Podcast with Margie Kay. Any rebroadcast or duplication of this program or its content without express written permission from Margie Kay is strictly prohibited. The Onyx News Podcast, in direct cooperation with the internet website margiekay.com.